Poking holes in Harry Potter's world building is a time-honoured tradition. Everything from full moons occurring on the wrong nights to time travel being clumsily written out of the story has been pointed out ad nauseum. Really, the entire series is a bit of a plot hole. You could take any element, Quidditch, the train to school, werewolf attacks, and find flaws in it. The bigger point which this kind of criticism skirts around is that the world building is very shallowly constructed. Everything in the wizarding world has its real-life equivalent, from schools to sports, banks, communication, travel. It creates a facade of reality, not one that holds up to scrutiny, but enough to persuade its 10-year-old readers that there's a sliver of hope they'll get their letter to Hogwarts. Harry Potter's strength, and the thing that sets it apart in a crowded subgenre of magic school books, is that it pretends to be real. Rowling leans into this. The books are an entry point into the Wizarding World franchise. Fans can go on Harry Potter tours and visit theme parks, they can buy cloaks and wands, they can do quizzes to find out their houses and Patronus. Before she became Britain's #1 self-appointed transphobe, J K Rowling was mostly poked fun of for holding onto the series too tightly, constantly adding details or filling in random plot holes. I think this is why the temptation to point out plot holes in Harry Potter is so much stronger than in any other series. Most children's fantasy invites a suspension of disbelief. Enid Blyton wants us to believe that somewhere there's a tree that connects to magic lands in the clouds. C.S. Lewis spends time and space in Narnia. But Rowling's series invites, even encourages, comparisons with the real world. Most of the questions she answers about the series are pedantic nitpicks of the world building. How do wizards work out their complex money system? Who manages the enrollments of Hogwarts? Critics who fall into the trap of pointing out plot holes often don't realise that the series is that way by design. Rowling wants you to critique the plot holes because there's always some convenient fix she can swoop in and clarify with a tweet, when she's not fantasising about going to prison for bigotry. So long as we're asking questions like, what do wizards think of TikTok, we're buying into the supposed reality of her world. Rowling is in a class of her own when it comes to separating the art from the artist. While the series was being written, she had a famously detailed plan for exactly what would happen, and there was a lot of mystique about her longhand plans for the final books. In the years since, she's never relinquished this role as the gatekeeper of all her series' secrets and keeps adding updates or plot revelations. Usually authors are gracious enough to acknowledge when there's a shortcoming in their work, but Rowling tends not to respond to any criticism more serious than pedantic nitpicks. She's still in author mode, treating the series like it's in active development. There's of course nothing wrong with continuing to develop world building after a series is over. Tolkien famously did this with Middle-earth. But for Tolkien, world building meant fleshing out lore and history within a strict set of self-imposed influences and rules. Reality and fantasy came from history and language, not well-puttied plot holes. One of the strangest things about Harry Potter is that despite its massive popularity, it didn't spawn many copycats. The Hunger Games sparked a million YA dystopias, and Twilight reignited the vampire craze. But with Harry Potter, surprisingly few people tried to capitalise on Rowling's success. I think a lot of this is rooted in the fact that the world building is deliberately derivative. Rowling has taken real-world ideas like the Philosopher's Stone, broomsticks, cauldrons, hexes and jinxes, and has made them her own, to the point that if anyone else were to use them, it would seem like they were ripping off Harry Potter. Rowling is occasionally accused of copying Jill Murphy's The Worst Witch, or various other wizard school books, which are a small subgenre in their own right. Usually the similarities between these books are pretty superficial, however, the concept of a school with wands and broomsticks is enough to start drawing comparisons. Harry Potter's popularity has kind of put the subgenre of magic schools to death. No one can write another magic school book without being compared to Harry Potter, unless they create completely unique world building. Rowling has always been reluctant to discuss her influences. She cited Homer, Shakespeare and Chaucer, but rejected any influence from the much more similar Roald Dahl, or even other authors who previously written magic school stories, like Diana Wynne Jones. Ursula K. Le Guin, who herself has a magic school story, pointed this out once in an interview. I didn't originate the idea of a school for wizards. If anybody did, it was T.H. White, though he did it in a single throwaway line and didn't develop it. I was the first to do that. Years later, Rowling took the idea and developed it along other lines. She didn't plagiarise. She didn't copy anything. Her book, in fact, could hardly be more different from mine, in style, spirit, everything. The only thing that rankles me is her apparent reluctance to admit that she ever learned anything from other writers. When ignorant critics praised her wonderful originality in inventing the idea of a wizard school, and some of them even seemed to believe that she had invented fantasy, she let them do so. This, I think, was ungenerous, and in the long run, unwise. In the early days of Rowling's career, her marketing team poured a lot of ink into painting her as a penniless divorcee scribbling her novels in cafes, something which her biographer acknowledged played into Harry Potter's marketing. Rowling's shtick was being an original, fresh voice reinventing magic and getting kids to read. But really, she was working in an established genre with a set of well-worn conventions, and there was nothing especially unique about her. To really understand Harry Potter, and to figure out how such a deliberately derivative series got a reputation for being so original, we need to look at what Rowling was being influenced by. Almost all of the magical world building in Harry Potter is taken from pre-existing mythology, something Rowling acknowledges she did as a way of giving texture to the world. The magical characters use wands to perform magic. They have pet owls and toads, they travel on broomsticks, they wear cloaks, and they brew potions in cauldrons. Witches and magic doers have existed in myth and literature for centuries, back to Circe and Medea in Greek myth. But the perception of witches as flying on broomsticks and brewing potions really took hold in the Middle Ages, around the time of the witch craze in 15th century Europe. The Black Death had decimated a third of Europe's population, and a terror of heretics and devil worshippers led people to accuse one another of performing witchcraft. Of course, that meant looking for obvious signs for what witches owned or did, and a mythology sprang up that witches flew on broomsticks and had familiars like black cats, making them easier to spot or single out. Magic as a category is so broad that it's almost meaningless. It encompasses practices from almost every culture throughout recorded human history, all the way back to cave paintings and Neolithic stone circles. There is no set doctrine, no central culture it's drawn from, no single underlying philosophy. The boundary between magic and religion is fluid. Pagan religion and early fertility cults are often lumped in under magic. J K Rowling had had a long period of planning the Harry Potter series. The idea came to her in 1990, but the first book wasn't released till 1997, and in that time she spent a long time researching real-world magic and developing the parameters of what her magic system could and couldn't do. Alchemy plays an important role in the world building, with real-life alchemist Nicholas Flamel appearing in the first book. Alchemy is an ancient practice combining rudimentary early chemistry with philosophy and mysticism. Alchemists were interested in the transmutation of matter, turning base metals like lead into gold. Horcruxes are a dark twist on the alchemical quest for eternal life. In fact, the Deathly Hallows symbol seems to be modelled on the alchemical symbol for the Philosopher's Stone. Alchemy even influenced the characters. Rowling says, "The colours red and white are mentioned many times in old texts on alchemy. One interpretation is that they, like base metal and gold, represent two different sides of human nature which must be reconciled. This was the inspiration for the Christian names of Rubeus, Red, Hagrid, and Albus, White, Dumbledore. These two men, both hugely important to Harry, seem to me to represent two sides of the ideal father figure he seeks." Rowling's magic system is an understory. It's designed to link all real-life magical mythologies. The alchemy in Harry Potter is functionally the same as alchemy in our world. The suggestion is that all alchemists were wizards who were found out by muggles. According to Rowling, the real-life witch burnings which took place in the Middle Ages were the point at which wizards split from muggles and became secretive, and real witches and wizards who were occasionally caught performed magic to protect themselves. The problem Rowling gets herself into is attempting to use this idea of an understory to link every instance of magic the world over. In 2016, she came under fire for a post on Pottermore about the history of magic in North America, which attempted to explain away skinwalkers. In Navajo legend, skinwalkers are evil witches who can take the form of animals. Rowling incorporates this mythology into her wizarding world, and claims that skinwalkers are just misunderstood witches and wizards with animagus abilities. Later, on Twitter, she said that, in my wizarding world, there were no skinwalkers. This was met with outcry for the fact that Rowling was taking a living tradition of marginalised people and was awkwardly misrepresenting it to try and make it suit her world building. Rowling's world-building is mostly drawn from European conceptions of magic developed in the Middle Ages, and clumsily applying it to other cultures where spirituality is a living and active practice just doesn't work. Essentially, Rowling's trying to create a single narrative which connects all instances of magic across cultures and throughout recorded time. It's both very ambitious and very unoriginal. Assuming that magic the world over has some kind of single unity is a bold claim, and critics of Rowling continually point out how her world-building is too rigid and inflexible to accommodate the fluidity of magic and spirituality from other cultures. As Navajo writer Brian Young wrote on Twitter in response to Rowling's controversy, J K Rowling, my beliefs are not fantasy. In fact, Rowling generally seems uncomfortable with the more mystical side of magic. In her world, magic is an inexhaustible force which is taught in an academic style, and there's almost no ritual or spirituality associated with it. Characters who are good at magic, like Hermione, are those who study hard, not those who are especially in tune with the universe or anything. Rowling's parody of the more mystical side of magic is Professor Trelawney, who teaches divination and is a bit of a fraud. Though she occasionally does have real visions, Trelawney generally makes bogus predictions and her class is seen as a bit of a waste of time. Of course, there is a real tradition of people pretending to be mediums and holding fake seances, and Rowling might be using Trelawney to nod to this. However, Trelawney's bohemian aesthetic and long speeches about her inner eye are played as a bit of a joke.
Oh! Your aura is pulsing, dear. Are you in the beyond? I think you are. Sure.
Trelawney often talks about having second sight, or an inner eye, an idea which comes from Eastern spiritual traditions. The third eye is an inner source of perception and spiritual insight, and can be opened through meditation and mindfulness. Of course, at Hogwarts, magic is a non-spiritual phenomenon which can be done on command, and so Trelawney is laughed at when she encourages her class to clear their minds and focus on their inner eye. Magic is immediate and irrefutable. No faith or belief is required to practice it. Any magic which doesn't fit the system, like tea leaf reading or palmistry, is taken less seriously. Harry Potter is categorised as fantasy. In a way, this is kind of misleading, because the genre it borrows from most heavily isn't fantasy, but school stories. The school story is a very old genre. It goes back to 1749, when Sarah Fielding published The Governess, or The Little Female Academy. This was a moralistic tale set at a girls' boarding school, written to teach good behaviour to young women. By the mid-1800s, the school story was a genre of its own. There was a flood of books set at boarding schools, usually split by gender, about students making friends, playing pranks, and studying for exams. There were popular generic scenes which popped up in a lot of them, like sporting events between rival houses. School stories were usually very moralistic, dealing with honour, sportsmanship, and loyalty. It was popular for school stories to follow the same cast of characters across multiple books, like Enid Blyton's Mallory Towers, or to have spin-offs where the main character's younger siblings attended the same school. Harry Potter is a typical school story in a lot of ways, and follows a lot of the same genre conventions. School stories tend to have flat characters who play certain roles, the class clown, the goody two-shoes, or the bully. Flat characters aren't necessarily the same thing as underwritten characters. They're designed to play a single, recognisable role, and they're common in certain genres, like murder mystery. The downside, especially when there are multiple books with the same characters, is that there isn't much room for character growth. In Enid Blyton's Mallory Towers, there's a character called Gwendolyn who is spoiled, vain, and sometimes a bully. In the final book, Gwendolyn's father falls very sick, and she reevaluates the way she's treated her parents and her classmates. Blyton can only give Gwendolyn character development in the final book because she's finished serving her purpose as the antagonist. Rowling's characters also occasionally fall into this problem. Dudley Dursley has a sympathetic exchange with Harry in the final book when he wishes Harry good luck. It suggests that there's more to Dudley than the spoiled bully we've come to know, but ultimately, we never get to find out. Dudley is only allowed this brief moment of development in the last book, when he's not needed anymore. Draco Malfoy is another example. In the later books, he shows potential for an interesting redemption arc, something which Rowling deliberately steered away from, saying Draco was not concealing a heart of gold under all that sneering and prejudice, and no, he and Harry were not destined to end up best friends. That's all well and good, but in that case, surely we'd expect Draco to be a case study of how privilege and prejudice can make weak people do monstrous things. Even in his Death Eater arc, Draco is passive. He's defined by inaction, not killing Dumbledore, not ratting out Harry, not standing up to his parents when they make him become a Death Eater. His entire character seems set up for him to make an important decision at some point, whether for good or evil, but he never does. He's the archetype of the rich school bully, and he doesn't have a role beyond that. Most 19th century boarding school stories are out of print now. They're all very steeped in the language and conventions of their time, and they tend to be pretty conservative, focusing on the lives of middle and upper class children and how they're upholding the age-old traditions of their schools. The reality of boarding schools, which most school stories tend to gloss over, is that they were full of abuse. During the early 20th century, when school stories were at their most popular, caning and beating were not only an acceptable form of punishment, but were seen as bettering the moral character of children. Spare the rod, spoil the child was conventional wisdom. Many authors, from Roald Dahl to Roger Fry, describe in their autobiographies how common it was to be beaten for very minor misbehaviour at their elite boys' schools. In The Guardian, Alex Renton writes, "What all the published memoirs share most obviously is their tone, wry, tolerant, and rather proud. It didn't do to make a fuss, or, more important, betray the caste." Public schools in Britain fought hard to keep the tradition of corporal punishment for years. The practice was only banned in 1998, a year after the first Harry Potter book came out. A lot of boarding school stories, especially those about boys, included descriptions of corporal punishment. However, in keeping with their more conservative tone, the authority of the teachers to inflict punishment usually isn't questioned. An exception to this is Charles Dickens, who wrote several books partly set at boarding school. Dickens was strongly in favour of children's rights and against corporal punishment, and was very critical of abuse in schools. In his novel Hard Times, he literally has a character called Mr. Machokumchild, and in Nicholas Nickleby, there's a very satisfying scene where the main character, Nicholas, beats up the schoolmaster, Wackford Squeers, who's been abusing and starving his pupils. But Dickens is the exception here. Usually, corporal punishment is portrayed in school stories as something you want to avoid, but not something that's systemically unjust. Interestingly, a lot of popular school story authors haven't actually been to boarding school. J K Rowling hadn't, nor had Talbot Baines-Reid or Enid Blyton, two of the most popular boarding school authors. Hogwarts is an outsider's whimsical idea of what boarding school must be like, with cosy common rooms, plenty of privacy, and mountains of delicious food. Hogwarts is an escapist fantasy, and, like most school stories, Rowling isn't interested in criticising the institution of boarding schools. All the same, the shadow of corporal punishment hangs over Hogwarts. The tensions involve anything from having lines cut into the back of students' hands to hunting for dark creatures in the Forbidden Forest. Every year, students are injured or killed at Hogwarts, but the structural management is never improved. School stories were at their peak of popularity in the early 20th century, and we might expect Rowling, who was writing in the 90s, to be more critical of the genre she's working in. But Rowling loves Hogwarts. The story never loses its roots as an escapist fantasy about a magic school where the main character is rich and famous and really good at flying on a broomstick. In his article, Alex Renton suggests that Harry Potter boosted the reputation and popularity of boarding schools, with a 30-year decline in enrolment stopping suddenly around 2000. One of the most damning criticisms of Harry Potter is that there's no systemic change throughout the books. Harry ends the story as a wizard cop, working for a ministry which facilitated Voldemort's rise to power. But school stories as a genre almost never show systemic change. Bad teachers might be fired, bad students might be reformed, but the powers that be always remain in place. Hogwarts is a plot hole of its own. While muggles in the 90s were using the internet, watching TV and phoning each other, Hogwarts students are trapped somewhere in the 19th century. The only characters who attempt to make widespread changes to the school curriculum or management are Dolores Umbridge and the Death Eaters, the villains of the series. In Book 5, Harry and his friends resist Umbridge by continuing to learn practical defense against the dark arts in secret. Any change is bad, and resistance means keeping to the original status quo. In Nicholas Nickleby, Wackford Squeers' school gets shut down because Charles Dickens has a point to make about children getting abused at boarding schools. But Rowling has no critique of boarding schools, or power. She accepts the conservative conventions of her genre and doesn't change a thing. There's another, deeper reason that the world of Harry Potter doesn't have any systemic change. Harry Potter is a school story, but it's also a satire. Rowling uses magic to set up parallels with the real world, creating what amounts to gentle parodies of pre-existing things made magical. The Ministry of Magic parallels the British Civil Service, with overly long department names and a Minister for Magic who acts as a wizard version of the Prime Minister. Quidditch riffs off school sporting culture. Pureblood wizards are effectively blue-blooded aristocracy, with Muggleborns basically being the equivalent of scholarship kids at Hogwarts. Much like her magic system, Rowling doesn't invent anything new, but reinvents pre-existing ideas with a layer of magic. Even history is mimicked, with Voldemort's return to power mirroring the rise of fascism. In fact, it's notable that the families who support him are by and large purebloods. If you didn't know, there was a strong fascist sympathy among Britain's aristocracy after the First World War. King Edward VIII, who was on the throne at the time, ignored rising fascism in Britain, and after abdicating he made an official visit to Nazi Germany. In fact, to make it very close to home, Prince Philip had 4 sisters who all married members of the German aristocracy, and 3 of those men became Nazis. In large part, the British aristocracy was drawn to fascism because of their own concerns about blood purity, an idea Rowling refers to with the term pureblood. Rowling's reliance on modelling everything in the wizarding world on pre-existing structures or events does explain a few of the more baffling world-building decisions. There's a very large house elf slavery problem that never gets resolved in the books, with a magical underclass of elves who carry out household chores and enjoy being enslaved. Hermione sticks up for them, but her activism is treated as a joke. My guess is that Rowling conceived house elves as a parallel of servants. Wealthy or pureblood families typically had house elves who would stay with them for generations, living in the house or on the grounds, much as servants did. Rowling also seems to be paying homage to the brownies of Scottish folklore, and maybe the fairy tale The Elves and the Shoemaker. Neither brownies nor elves in this fairy tale are enslaved. In fact, they operate on their own whims and are easily offended or frightened. The house elves' predicament seems to be there only to serve Dobby's storyline, one of the many instances when an important world-building choice wasn't fully thought through. This is why so much of the world-building in Harry Potter feels kind of weightless. It's there as a parody, an allegory. Like the magic system, it's deliberately unoriginal. There's very little unique to wizard society that doesn't have a real-world parallel. Again, this goes back to the question of why no one mimics Harry Potter. It doesn't give later authors a foundation to build upon. Its world-building is as thin as paper. We could spend all day poking plot holes in Harry Potter, but it doesn't go to the deeper underlying problem. The world-building has no structural integrity. It's a one-to-one model of the real world, but with magic, and even the magic isn't original. And so, it's inevitable there's no systemic change in Harry Potter. For there to be change, Rowling would need to go off-script. In the final 2 books she has the opportunity to do this, but ultimately she plays it safe and sticks to what's worked for her so far. In 2011, the site Pottermore was founded. It was a way to share news, games and background material on the wizarding world, and for J K Rowling to expand the series. However, the more Rowling shared about the wizarding world, the more plot holes began to appear. For instance, she shared a map of the major wizarding schools around the world, and fans quickly pointed out that the catchment areas just don't make sense. They cover huge swaths of the world, meaning a school like Durmstrang services people speaking tens of different languages. Within the world of the novel, Hogwarts is just believable. We only hear about 2 other magic schools, which is enough to hint at the breadth of the wizarding world without giving away too much information. By releasing a map of all the wizarding schools, J K Rowling has killed the illusion. World building in Harry Potter works best when there's some sort of mystery. Flamel is a good example of this. Rowling never drags him into the story too much or over-explains how he discovered the Philosopher's Stone. The more Rowling explains, the more plot holes appear, like the Fantastic Beasts films, which take place in New York in the 1920s. One question which fans have often posed of the main series was, why didn't the wizards stop the world wars? Ultimately, it's not a question that matters, but Rowling is determined to find an answer. The Fantastic Beasts films clumsily try and link Grindelwald to the Nazis, giving the wizarding world their own equivalent of Hitler to deal with. But there's one crucial thing Rowling doesn't over-explain, or explain at all. Magic. I pointed out earlier that magic in Harry Potter is taught very academically. However, crucially, it's never confirmed where the magic comes from. It just exists. In the 11th century, Thomas Aquinas made a threefold distinction between the natural, the supernatural, and the preternatural. The natural world is the one we live in, the world of cause and effect. Supernatural acts are ones that God performs, when the natural world is punctured by miraculous events, or when things act in a way which violates their inherent nature, like someone being resurrected from the dead. Preternatural describes things which are beyond nature, angels, demons, ghosts, things which follow internally consistent rules which we don't understand. From a purely narrative standpoint, Rowling's magic is preternatural. In fact, if she were to rush in and explain where it comes from and how it works, it would stop being magic. Colin Wilson's 1971 book The Occult is a classic introduction to the world of the weird. The book is a broad overview of magic across recorded history, from ancient fertility cults to miracles performed by monks and mages, and Wilson attempts to answer one question: is there a unifying thread which underpins all instances of magic? Interestingly, the answer he comes up with isn't especially magical, it's philosophical. He calls it Faculty X. In one chapter, Wilson describes a scene from Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, in which a character called the Whiskey Priest stands in front of a firing squad. Wilson writes, "With a terrible shock, he knows that he is going to die, now, within seconds. His inner being revolts, his energies surge like a tidal wave. He makes a more powerful effort than he has made in his whole life. For a second, he experiences freedom, then realizes with despair that he could have made the same effort in any of the billion or so seconds of his previous life. He has wasted his life in a kind of dream. We are all in this position, all human beings. We, you and I, are infinitely stronger than we ever realize." In Book 7, Harry discovers that he is the final Horcrux. There is no way out. To defeat Voldemort, he has to die. He felt more alive, and more aware of his own living body than ever before. Why had he never appreciated what a miracle he was, brain and nerve and bounding heart? It would all be gone, or at least he would be gone from it. In the Forbidden Forest, Harry faces Voldemort and survives the killing curse, completing a pattern that's been building across 7 books. At every crisis, when face to face with death, Harry manages to pull off extraordinary feats of magic and survival. Like Graham Greene's Whiskey Priest, he's able to repeatedly realize his own strength, his own capacity. Harry isn't an especially academically gifted wizard, but he's a strong spellcaster and a strong protagonist because of his determination, his strength of will, his Faculty X. Wilson describes Faculty X as the ability all people have to access deep, sudden bursts of insight or power which exceed our normal daily consciousness. Faculty X, he says, is simply that latent power that human beings possess to reach beyond the present. Okay, this isn't to say Colin Wilson is correct or that Faculty X is a magical phenomenon. In fact, Wilson's doing the same thing I criticised Rowling for, trying to connect up a whole lot of disparate forms of magic, which I've already suggested is quite dubious. The point here is that Rowling's vision of magic is much more psychological and compelling than any of her other world building because it relates directly to Harry's strengths as a protagonist. I think Rowling was probably led to this through her intuition as a storyteller, rather than any beliefs about magic or anything. Obviously, there had to be impediments to spellcasting and difficult magic to give Harry some challenges. But still, it presents us with a really interesting image of what magic is. In Harry Potter, the mind is the source of magical power. Spells take conscious effort and deliberation to cast. 2 of the worst curses, the Imperius Curse and the Cruciatus Curse, involve controlling or destroying people's minds. Let's return to Wilson's definition of Faculty X. That latent power that human beings possess to reach beyond the present. To me, it seems pretty clear he's talking about the imagination. We all have the capacity to reach beyond the present and conjure up things which haven't or didn't happen in our heads. Imagination plays an active part in spellcasting. To perform a Patronus charm, the caster must concentrate on a single happy memory. A boggart can only be banished if you can think of a way to make it funny. We tend to think of the imagination as something separate from our daily life, but it's really not. We're always engaging our imaginations when we're looking at objects because we need to fill in the parts of them we can't see. Our imagination is also a decision-making faculty. When we're weighing up choices, we have to be able to imagine a counterfactual, even weird ones. If I throw a stone into the air, I can imagine it never coming down again, even if that's physically impossible. Our imaginations do have limits. If I tell you to imagine a square yellow room that has no corners and is entirely blue, you can't do it. But if I tell you to imagine a unicorn, you can. The unicorn is an ontological possibility. It could exist in the material world, even if it doesn't. Imagination is a way of perceiving regions of the real. To quote the poet William Blake, everything to be imagined is an image of the truth. Or, to push it even further with another Blake quote, the imagination is not a state, it is the human existence itself. In Harry Potter, wands give witches and wizards the ability to enact the imaginal in the material world. Imagine if this guy turned into a dog. Imagine if these candles floated. Imagine if slugs. I think this is why so many critics were tripping over themselves to compliment Rowling's originality. There's nothing especially original about the story, but the sheer childlike imaginality of the magic system makes the whole wizarding world feel like we're perceiving the real world through an overactive imagination spilling over with ideas. Counterintuitively, I think the world-building's closeness to the real world is what makes it seem more inventive than it really is. It does feel a bit weird trying to find positives in the world building of Harry Potter. J K Rowling's tirades of online bigotry and transphobia has made me, and a lot of other readers, very happy leaving this series in the past. So if there's anything to take from Harry Potter, I think it's this very abstract idea that Rowling herself might not even have been consciously aware of as she was writing. The magic of her series isn't a fancy boarding school or Latin incantations or wands or alchemical symbolism. It's the imagination. And we all have an imaginative capacity. Some of us might even have a bit more than Rowling has.
Is this all real? Or is it just happening inside my head?
Of course it's happening inside your head, Harry. Why should that mean that it's not real?
To this day, J K Rowling is still developing the wizarding world. We're about to get a whole new Harry Potter TV show, which will probably come with a deluge of plot hole fixes. I think Rowling's pathological need to constantly refresh the world building goes deeper than just being too attached to the story. The wizarding world isn't self-sustaining. As I mentioned before, Harry Potter isn't a book you can mimic without copyright infringement. The world building is unoriginal and is only sustained for as long as she's adding new elements. It can't exist independently of the real-world parallels or magical mythology. Rowling's famous saying goes, "Hogwarts will always be there to welcome you home." The franchise is financially invested in seeming real, on getting you to play the games and buy the robes and care about what house you're in. And yet, ironically, the world building has no real weight or substance. It has more plot holes than a sponge. It's only made real by adding more information, more things you can buy, more plot hole fixes or needless details. Magic is the one thing Rowling doesn't try to explain, and so It's the only really self-sustaining part of the world building. For her, in order for something to be real, it has to be grafted onto the existing world and explained in excruciating depth. Which is maybe the biggest irony of the series, because what is magic if not the unexplainable? Hello, Editing Kate jumping in just to say a huge thank you to my wonderful patrons for supporting this channel. If you'd like to join them and get access to a monthly newsletter and bonus content, then do consider joining my Patreon through the link in the description. And thank you so much for watching the video.